We continue our study of Genesis, and we are in Genesis, the 38th chapter. And before we start Genesis 38, let me reiterate how that Moses is a masterful writer. I don't want to overstate the case any more than I need to, but I think it bears repeating that Moses knows what he's doing when he writes these books and when he tells the stories that are within these books. He knows how to build the drama. He knows how to build suspense. And he knows how to put the zinger in, if you want to put it that way, at just the right moment. And Genesis 38 is one of those examples of how Moses is a master at really telling a story. In Genesis 38, we focus on Judah. Now, as you know from the bloodline of Jesus, Judah is the tribe from which our Lord came. And so we've already seen how that the sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob, have already done many things that were over the line and even wrong. How that they even sold their brother Joseph into slavery. They had intended to kill him, and then they just sold him into Egyptian slavery. And now we come to Judah in chapter 38, and at this point, Judah was still a worldly man. He was still a man that did not have a very good spiritual anchor. He knew what the truth was. He believed in the one true God. But as far as his moral life, as far as his way of living every day is concerned, Judah was very much like those round about him. And how different is that from a lot of people that we see today, who claim to be religious, and yet in their day-to-day life, they're no different from the world. Judah was of that mentality at this point. But what we're about to look at here in chapter 38 is a turning point. This is a turning point in this man's life, and it's for the good. But the way that Moses tells this story, you would think it's ripped off of today's headlines. You would think that this is a made-for-TV movie. You would think that this is part of a mini-series. It's just the way that he tells the story. Verse 1, "And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. An Adulamite is from a small ancient city named Adullam." So this is a very small town that he is visiting. "Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her." That is to say, he took her in an intimate sense. This is a Canaanite woman. Remember how that the sons of Israel had massacred several people because they had dared suggest to intermarry and commingle. And now we have Judah doing this very thing. And then verse 3 says, "So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Kezib that she bore him." Now, Kezib is southwest of Adullam. You know where that is, right? Well, anyway, it's giving you an idea. Southwest of Adullam, not far from where we see this town mentioned at the very top of the chapter. Verse 6, "Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar." All right, now get that name fixed in your head. It's going to factor in a major way in this chapter. "But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord took his life." Now, implied in these few verses is the fact that we have a skip in time. From verse 1 to verse 8, you've got a skip of at least 18 years. Because his son, the firstborn son, now grows up to the point where he can take a wife. So you've got a space of time involved that Moses doesn't mention, but it's strongly suggested by what he describes here. So he was evil, was. This indicates, to me at least, that Judah is not as spiritually grounded as he ought to be. Otherwise, he would have taken the lead in rearing his son the way he should have been reared. So the Lord took his life. Now, how evil do you have to be for the Lord to intervene in a miraculous way and take your life? Well, that's how bad got. Notice. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother." Now, to us, that seems very unusual. That seems a little bit strange. But when you look at Deuteronomy chapter 25, specifically verse 6 of that chapter, you'll find that Moses mentions the practice of levirate marriage. Levirate marriage is in case one person dies, his brother would marry the widow and keep that bloodline, that seed alive. That's levirate marriage. You've got two brothers. One marries, then he dies. His wife is now a widow. The brother then steps in and takes his sister-in-law for wife to keep that bloodline going so the bloodline does not end there. It's a practice, a very common practice among the Israelites, and it was, the principle at least, was set forth here. Verse 9 tells us, Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. We look at that and we say, whoa, this is in the Bible? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Just as much as Song of Solomon is part of the Bible. As explicit as Song of Solomon gets, here Moses gets pretty explicit. He describes what happens. What was promised is not performed, in other words. Verse 10. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Now look at this. He's promised to perform this service to keep the bloodline alive. He refuses to accomplish it. And so God intervenes and takes his life. Verse 11. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought, "I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Okay, now get this set up. Moses is setting this thing up beautifully. All right, you've got who's already died because of it being evil. Then you have Onan, who does not perform what he promised to do. The Lord takes his life. So now Judah steps in because the widow, Tamar, is part of his household. He has the authority to do this. He tells her, remain here in your father's house as a widow until Shelah, his other son, becomes of age. What he intends to do is to have Shelah perform the service that Onan should have done. And so in his mind, Moses mentions that he thought, "I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So he's already seen two of his sons die at the hands of the Lord, and that has sobered Judah considerably. And so he doesn't want the same thing to happen to him. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now, after a considerable time, how much time passes? Moses doesn't tell us specifically, but it has to be a number of years. So a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. This is northwest of Adullam. We're going now northwest of that town that we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter. It was told to Tamar, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." Now think about this for a moment. She's been promised by Judah that when my other son gets old enough, he's going to perform the service that Onan should have done. Well, considerable time has passed. It hasn't happened. She's now getting desperate. She's thinking perhaps, I'm not getting any younger. And it's going to come a time where I can't bear children to keep the bloodline going. So she's getting desperate. And that sets the stage for what's about to happen. Verse 14. So she removed her widow's garments. Now think about this. All this time, all these years, Tamar has been dressed as a widow. She has had the widow's garments on. Because of what Judah had told her. Remain a widow in the house until my son can perform what's going to happen. So all this time, she's been dressed as a widow, waiting for the promised act that Judah had said. But notice what she does. She covered herself with a veil or shawl and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw, here's the reason Moses gives, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. Moses tells us why she's doing this. He's come of age, at least 18, we would assume, now probably in his early 20s. And he still hasn't been given to her, Tamar, as a husband. Or she hasn't been given to him as a wife. So she's getting desperate. So what is the significance of her covering herself with this veil and wrapping herself? Later on, we're going to see that the garment that she put on, the disguise that she put on, was that of a harlot. Now, why is she doing this? Moses is about to tell us. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. She was dressed like a harlot would that would be standing on the side of the road. He didn't recognize her. Now this tells you a lot what's about to happen. This tells you a lot about where Judah is in his spiritual journey, if you will. He hasn't advanced much from the time that Joseph was sold into slavery. Watch this, verse 16. So he turned aside to her by the road, and he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? Now we would have to assume, even though Moses doesn't tell us, we would have to assume that Tamar disguised her voice. Because we would think that Judah would have recognized her voice immediately. Well, she must have disguised her voice where he couldn't recognize her. He said, therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it? He said, what pledge shall I give you? Oh boy, now here's where she baits the trap. And she said, your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. Seal, cord, and staff. The seal would be a signet ring that would be used to imprint documents. The cord would be what he would be wearing, and the staff would be what was in his hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed, and removed her veil, and put on her widow's garments. I've got 3 exclamation points right by that sentence. I mean, she knew exactly what she's doing. She's a desperate woman. She thinks the son of Judah is not going to be given to me anytime soon, and so I've got to do something. So she decides to pull this one over on Judah. Now, watch what happens. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. Aha! Something's up. He sends the goat to get back his seal, his cord, and his staff. She's not where she was. He asked the men of her place, saying, where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? The temple prostitute. That's what she had disguised herself as. But they said, there has been no temple prostitute here. That should have told him something right then. He should have known something was afoot at this point when she's not where she was. This also tells me, by the way, this isn't the first time that Judah has done something like this. This is the way I take it. In other words, this isn't the first time he's done this. So, verse 22, he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here. Then Judah said, let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughing stock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her. What's Judah worried about? Not worried about the fact that he's done this with what he thinks is a prostitute. That's not what he's worried about. What he's worried about is losing face. Well, see, this transaction was made, and let's just let her go ahead and keep those items because, after all, sent the goat. That's what you're concerned about? That's where Judah was at this point. Yes, sir?
He's got to think that a signet ring, that's the same thing as getting stealing somebody's passport now.
Yes.
She could trick him and fake documents.
Absolutely. She could put his seal on any kind of document she wanted, and it would be with his imprimatur, and she could go to town with it. So he ought to have been very concerned about this, but apparently he's not. Now, verse 24, notice this, what Moses drops on us. Now, it was about 3 months later. 3 months passes. 3 months' time. That Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. So 3 months passes, and Tamar is obviously expecting a child, and the worst is assumed. Oh, she's played the harlot. She's gone and had a child by somebody that's not her husband. So what does Judah say? Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. That's harsh, isn't it? Very harsh. But Judah had that authority. As wrong as it may seem, he had the authority to do that. Watch what happens. It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see, whose signet ring and cords and staff are these? What a stunner. When she mentions the signet ring, the cords, and the staff, she knows exactly what she's doing. She drops that bomb on Judah. This plays out just like a drama you would see on television or on movies. You can hear the dramatic music, boom, 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 when he gets that word. How does he react? Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not have relations with her again. He realized in that moment, he realized that he, Judah, had driven her, Tamar, to do this. All these years that have passed, she's been patiently waiting for his son to be given as a husband to her, and it hasn't been done. She's already gone through disappointment after disappointment, and now she decides to take matters in her own hands, and she is indeed going to have a child the way that, on her terms, and she is reminding Judah, you haven't fulfilled your end of that promise you made to me all those years ago. This is a turning point in this man's life. Yes, sir?
There's a New Testament application here, and I think it's 1 Corinthians 7, and it talks about the due benevolence.
Yes.
Okay, right here, there was, they left out the due benevolence and look what happened.
Yeah, exactly right. You're exactly right. Due benevolence. As far as the marital relationship, the wife hasn't power over her own body but the husband. The husband has not power over his own body but the wife. And you see how that is not fulfilled with what Onan did. You see how that was not fulfilled in the other son of Judah. And then it was not fulfilled for a long time when Judah did not give his third son to her. So that due benevolence that Paul talks about surely had not been fulfilled. Absolutely. But this is a turning point in Judah's life. Up to this point, Judah has been very worldly minded. Up to this point, Judah has been not thinking clearly. He's been allowing his passions, his physical passions, to have the rule over him. Now, he's given a wake-up call. And look at what takes place. It came about at the time she was giving birth, that behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. You know what Perez means? A breach. So he's named after what took place at the birth. Perez. Afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. Zerah means a dawning or a brightness. Now, what does that have to do with anything with us? A lot more than you think. Mark this with your finger if you got your Bible out. Turn over to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew, the first chapter. The first chapter of the first gospel that we have in our Bibles. Beginning with verse 1. The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. This Perez, born to Tamar, as a result of the deception that she pulled on Judah, is in the bloodline of Jesus Christ. That speaks volumes about the grace of our Lord, doesn't it? That speaks volumes about the providence of God working through difficult circumstances to accomplish His will. Perez is in the bloodline of the Messiah. All that Moses describes here in chapter 38 has a purpose. And that purpose is to show one of the people in our Lord's bloodline the circumstances that led to Him being there. Any questions, comments before we get into chapter 39? I love this kind of thing. I'm overwhelmed constantly when I read what Moses writes, and I examine it from the perspective of a writer, and I examine it from the perspective of a drama, and I examine it from the perspective, of course, of the Scriptures. It amazes me how much Moses brings in, how much he brings to bear on the text. It's just tremendous. I just can't say enough about what he does. Chapter 39. We're about to embark on a fabulous story. You see, we've already seen Joseph introduced. Joseph has been in Egypt. He was sold by his brothers to Egyptian slavery. What's happened to Joseph? Well, Moses is going to bring us up to speed on what happens. This story, I think I mentioned this to you before, this story of Joseph, along with the story of Hester, are the two favorites of the Jews to this day. They love these stories. And there's a reason for it. With Joseph, you have the providence of God displayed beautifully all the way through. Joseph remains faithful to the Lord in spite of his circumstances. And the circumstances he encounters are more than a lot of people could bear through. So we come to chapter 39, and it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. He's reminding us what had happened. And Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had taken him down there. Now, you notice what Moses says, and it seems like Moses is just describing what's happened. There's more here than meets the eye at first blush. Notice how he describes Potiphar. He says Potiphar is an Egyptian officer. Well, of course he's Egyptian. Why would he mention that? But notice, he's an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh. Why would he mention that Potiphar is an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh? Isn't Pharaoh an Egyptian? Not necessarily. If you look at the history of the Pharaonic dynasties, there is a period of time, about the 15th and 16th dynasties of Egypt, that you have a foreign power which is in place in Egypt. At the end of the 14th dynasty, there were some Asian tribes, and when I say Asian, I mean those who are east of Egypt. Some Asian tribes who migrated in, had been migrating in for some time, and then about the 14th dynasty, they made their move and overthrew the Egyptian dynasty that was in place and set up their own dynasty. They were named the Hyksos, Hyksos, the Hyksos dynasty. They were in power from the 15th through the 16th dynasties. And then in the 17th dynasty, they were overthrown by native Egyptians who then retook the throne, as it were. Now, why is this significant? Because what Moses mentions here strongly implies this. Potiphar was an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh. Now, what significance would that have for Joseph? Joseph was not Egyptian. Joseph was of Israel's brood. In other words, he was an Israelite, as it were, in that sense. He was foreign. So all the things that happened with Joseph that we're going to see described by Moses could not have happened if there were an Egyptian on the throne in Egypt. Because what we know from Egyptian history, native-born Egyptians did not allow foreigners to have any authority in the country. But during the 15th and 16th dynasties, when the Egyptian power elite were driven out and foreigners took the throne as Pharaoh and set up their own dynasties, that allowed the circumstances to be in place for a foreigner to come in and rise through the ranks. Joseph. Yes, sir.
There's a lot of speculation, too, that this Pharaoh brought in the one God concept which Moses grew up with in his educational system.
It's a possibility. We do know that later on, down the road, there would be an Egyptian Pharaoh who had introduced the worship of the sun god and had the one god Aten. And that was for a period of time, and then they reverted back to Egyptian gods and goddesses. There's no doubt that what happened with Joseph and then what would happen with Moses and the Israelites had an impact on Egyptian religion and the pantheon of gods. But here we find that the stage is being set, has already been set, for somebody like Joseph to be able to move up. Even at this point, though, he didn't think that he was going to amount to anything in Egypt. He was by himself in a strange land, had no idea what was going to happen. All he knew was that the God of my fathers is with me. Israel, Jacob, had reared him right. He was trying to amend for the mistakes that he had made in not rearing his other sons correctly. He had reared Joseph right, as we're going to see beautifully displayed here. So, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. So Potiphar buys him, he comes into that house, the Lord's with Joseph, and he does what he's told to do, does it faithfully, and he's rewarded for it. Verse 3, now his master saw that the Lord was with him and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Now, does that mean that Potiphar was a worshiper of the one true God? No. Likely he was seeing that his God is with him. Just like my gods are with me, his God is with him. He can see that. And so, verse 4, Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. and all that he owned, or he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. He gives this foreigner, this slave that had been sold to him, he gives him authority over his entire house. That's no small thing. When a native-born Egyptian gives a foreign slave authority over his entire household, that's not insignificant at all. This palatial estate must have been like a palace. Potiphar was a man of authority, after all. So Joseph's in charge, only answerable to Potiphar. That's not going to be the last time that kind of arrangement happens. Verse 5. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. Do you see the providence of God at work? This is not miraculous. This is not miraculous. This is providential. Joseph is faithful to his Lord. His Lord blesses him and blesses that house, blesses everything in connection with Potiphar's house, and it's quite obvious. So, verse 6, he, that is Potiphar, left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Full and complete trust. That's the kind of relationship that Joseph had at this point with Potiphar. Potiphar trusted him with everything in his house. That tells me that Joseph was a young man that displayed that kind of loyalty and that kind of devotion, that kind of trust, that people could actually put their faith in him. Now, Moses drops this little tidbit, this little detail. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now think about it. By this point, Joseph's in his early to mid-20s. He's in the prime of manhood. He's been in Egypt for, about 4 or 5 years at least. And he's likely very tanned from being out in the sun a good bit, not only with his father's household, but now in Egypt. Maybe he's adopted some of the Egyptian dress to fit in. He's a man that's got this bearing about him. You've seen the people, the actors and actresses that have the it factor that you can't really define. Joseph had the it factor. Joseph had this look, this bearing, this presence that when he would walk in a room, likely every head would turn. He was a man that was going somewhere. That is, when people would look at him. Verse 7, now, watch what happens. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." We're not told by Moses whether or not Potiphar's wife was a beautiful woman. I would have to infer that she was. Otherwise, there would have been no temptation involved. She had to have been a very strikingly good-looking woman. And she wanted Joseph. Does this sound like it's ripped out of the pages of headlines? Does this sound like it's ripped out of a made-for-television movie, a Lifetime thriller movie? One of those mini-series that you would see at night? My dad one time was teaching about Joseph at a youth camp up in Tennessee and went through the entire story, and of course we know how it ends. We're going to get to that point in just a few minutes. And one of the young men in the back, teenage boys in the back, said, he was stupid. What? What? Well, the fact is that's the way the world looks at it. The world looks at this kind of thing. You going to turn down an opportunity like this? You've got charge over all the house. Who's going to know? Go ahead. You've got everything in your hands. Go ahead and take it. That's what the world tells us today, isn't it? Isn't that what the world tells the young people today and tells older folks that ought to know better for that reason? You've got everything. Just go ahead and get that. Grab it. Grab the brass ring. You only go around once. You only live once. You've got to mark this off your bucket list. Is that what Joseph thought? Watch this. Verse 8. But he refused and said to his master's wife, Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? I've got 4 exclamation points written by that statement. How can I do this great evil? To Joseph, at this point, in a foreign land, he's been away from his father and his brothers all these years. At this point in his life, Joseph knew that if he took advantage of this situation, it would be evil and it would be sin. Joseph knew there are things that are right and things that are wrong. He had been reared right. Israel had done a great job of rearing this young boy. He knew the difference. Would to God that a lot of young people today knew that difference. Would to God that many adults knew that difference. I've often used this very chapter, this very story in sermons about virtue to young people at youth rallies and also when I have preached in the past. Joseph was a virtuous young man, and he kept his standards high. We've got to do the same thing, especially in the world in which we live. In the 21st century, you've got opportunities galore to do wrong, both privately and publicly. Yes, sir.
You ever wonder why both Eli and Samuel never taught their boys or this little lesson?
You'd have to wonder, why did Eli allow his sons to be so loose? Why did Samuel allow his sons to become so morally corrupt? Every generation has to be taught the truth. Every generation has to be taught right. Our preachers all used to say years back, we stand one generation away from apostasy. And that's so true. Not just doctrinally, but also morally. We stand one generation away from apostasy. What does that mean? That means we teach our sons, our daughters, our grandsons, and our granddaughters what's right and what's wrong and stick with it. Now, they've got to make their own decisions. They'll have their moment like Joseph had, where they're in a strange place and they're confronted with choices to make. They have to make their decision. But we've got to be able to know that we taught them what's right and what's wrong. That when they make that decision, it's on them. It's not on us. Look what happens. Verse 10. As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or be with her. Every day, day in, day out, every day she's putting the pressure on him. And I'm sure Moses doesn't describe it, but I'm sure she tries to get more and more sultry every time that she approached him, trying to put the pressure on him. But he didn't listen. Verse 11. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. No witnesses. No witnesses. Maybe Moses doesn't tell us, but maybe she arranged for all them to be out of the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. Think about this, brethren. Joseph literally fled fornication. Paul said, 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee fornication. If you've got to run from it, run from it. Flee from it. Joseph had this situation where she was just bound, determined to do it. She caught him by his clothes, and he just literally ran out of his clothes, ran out of his outer clothes, and ran outside. When she saw that he left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed." She appeals to the prejudice of the Egyptians against Israelites. This Hebrew that my husband, brought in, he's done this. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. I've got the evidence. Here's his evidence. See? So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, the Hebrew slave, notice that, whom you brought to us, came in to me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now how does Potiphar react to it? Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what your slave did to me, his anger burned. That's not unusual to think. He didn't know all the situation. But what was he angry about? Who was he angry at? Notice what happens. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the jail. Now think about this. If Joseph was guilty of what his Potiphar's wife alleged, Joseph could have had a lot done to him as punishment. This is a light punishment. Yes, he's thrown in prison, but it's the king's prison. The king's prison. That tells me possibly, and this is my speculation, that Potiphar possibly did not believe his wife. I really have a hunch that he didn't believe his wife. But he was angry at the situation. He couldn't say that she was lying because, after all, she's got the coat. But something's got to be done for him to save face. So he throws Joseph into this king's prison. That tells me a lot. In other words, this isn't the first time this possibly has happened. And the only difference is now she's got evidence to back herself up. Notice, verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph. Again, providence, and extended kindness to him and gave a favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail. He rises up to the top of his situation again. So that whatever was done there, Joseph, was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. Even in the king's prison, jailed unjustly, falsely accused, Joseph rises up to the top again. This young man is going places. He just doesn't know where yet. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's another New Testament application in 1 Corinthians 10, I think 13, God is faithful. And he will not allow you to be tempted above that which you are able to bear without providing the means of escape. So there was an escape, although he went to jail, he still did that.
He had the way of escape, run. He fled. Yes, it led to prison, but he kept his integrity. He kept his virtue. He kept his faithfulness to God. And now he's risen up to the top once again in this situation. Don't you see how the Israelites and the Jews love this story? And it gets even better. It gets even better. And I'm looking forward to the rest of it.